How much income could $100,000 buy you? Would it be enough to cover your groceries, your car payment, maybe your mortgage? Today we're going to find out.
So let's take a look at how much income $100,000 can buy you today. And the answer to that question, like a lot of things in life, is it depends. And it depends on where you put your money. So there's a few different strategies when it comes to dividend investing that you can pick. And one would be dividend growth. Funds like VIG or DGRO, where you get a lower yield to start, somewhere maybe 1.5%, 2%. But that dividend payment should grow over time. So that would get you, $2,000 a year or so to start, or $167 a month. If you go into a more balanced strategy like SCHD, or for my European friends, TDIV, that might get you 3.5%, 4% as a starting yield. So you might get $3,500 a year or close to $300 a month. You could go into a high yield fund, something like SPYD, that buys the highest yielding stocks in the S&P 500. That might get you 4.5%, $4,500 a year, or $375 a month. And then I gave an example of one high yield stock here of Realty Income, which currently yields close to 6%. So you're going to get $5,700 a year or $475 a month. So now what I want to do is just take you through each one of these strategies, kind of show you how it works, who it's for, and then I'll give you an example of a stock that kind of matches each one. So we'll start with our dividend growth strategy. It is what it sounds like. We focus on companies that keep raising that dividend payout, even if our starting yield is modest. So again, your example funds, the Dividend Appreciation ETF from Vanguard, ticker VIG, or the iShares Core Dividend Growth ETF. You're going to get that 1.5%, 2% yield, a few $1,000s in dividends to start with, but that's not really the goal. The goal is that payout keeps increasing. For example, VIG holds companies that have increased their dividend for at least 10 consecutive years. And obviously, by that, we expect them to keep increasing the dividend for the next 10. And over time, that consistent increasing dividend, not only will it grow our income, but if we reinvest, it buys more and more shares. And eventually, you get exponential growth in your income stream. So here's an example. Here's if you start with a 2% yield and get 8% growth. This is with dividends reinvested. Year one, you're going to get $2,000 in dividends. By year 10, you're up over $5,000. And in year 20, you're getting nearly $13,000 in yearly dividends. So you can see that growth really happens, but it just takes some time to get there. So in his example, I used ADP. You might know them. You might use them at work. They do what they call HCM, human capital management. That means HR, payroll, benefits, compliance. They do recruiting. They do retirement, and they're pretty global. You can see they operate in more than 140 countries. It's a dividend aristocrat. They've raised the dividend for over 45 years. You're getting a moderate starting yield. 2.4 is not bad right now. But the long-term dividend growth rate's really the impressive part. It's 12% a year over the last decade. And you can see the dividend per share just increasing every single year in the chart there. And you can imagine the power of that dividend growth if this is a company you've held for a long time. If you put $100,000 into ADP 10 years ago, here's what you'd wind up with. You'd have more than 1,400 shares today if you reinvested your dividends, and you'd have more than $8,000 every single year in dividends, giving you a yield on cost of 8.5%. So you can see, I don't know what the starting yield was. I don't remember when I did this calculation, but you can see over time that compounding effect really grows that yield on cost. Your next option is a balanced strategy. This is a higher starting yield, but it's combined still with a strong history of dividend increases. So I put SCHD in here, mainly because of the low valuation on that right now, and it's got a pretty high starting yield. Or again, TDIV for the Europeans, you're going to get somewhere around 3.5% on those, so $3,500 in income. And really, this looks for high quality companies that are financially healthy, and they can sustain a high payout while they're still growing that dividend attractively year over year. So you get a bigger income stream today, but you're still going to get a competitive long-term dividend growth rate going this route. So for an example balanced stock, I picked Hershey. A lot of people know them for their chocolate there, but they also have a pretty strong snack portfolio. And this is a classic example of a consumer staples company that kind of fits that balance strategy. It's got a better starting yield than ADP at 3.3%, but it still had impressive dividend increases. So 9% a year over the last decade. So excellent anchor for a compounding portfolio, it's stock that kind of looks like this. And if we would have put $100,000 in Hershey 10 years ago, again, over 1,400 shares, $8,129 in dividends. So yield on cost up 8.1% there. So you can see we kind of wind up almost in the same spot. You just start with a higher yield this way. And then option 3, we can go for the highest possible current payout. So this is if you need cash flow now, you just kind of need to know that there might be a trade-off, which is lower dividend growth later. So the S&P 500 high dividend ETF gets you 4.5% yield, so $4,500. It buys the 80 highest yielding stocks in the S&P 500, but again, companies with yields this high just don't tend to grow their dividend quite as quickly. These are more mature companies. They're growing slower, so the dividend grows slower with them. And the big danger here is that if that dividend payout doesn't increase at least as quickly as inflation, then you're losing purchasing power over time with a longer holding period. So I went with Realty Income for our high income stock here. Pretty well known REIT. They do triple net leases. So these are buildings like, supermarkets, shopping centers, big commercial buildings. This is a massive, massive REIT. They are known as the monthly dividend company because they pay a dividend every single month, which a lot of people that like that high income really appreciate. So again, known for the monthly dividend payments. They have to pay out at least 90% of their taxable income to shareholders. That's part of being a REIT. So you get that 5.7, that high yield, but the dividend growth rate is lower than our other examples. So it's 4% per year. Again, income starting out is high, but the growth might be more limited than some of those other companies. So here's our $100,000 in Realty Income 10 years ago. You end up with 3,500 shares today, $11,308 in dividends, and a yield on cost of 11.3%. And this looks impressive. And I know you're asking, why would I go with any of the others? This one did so much better when it comes to the income. And to be fair, I calculated everything with dividend reinvestment. But you have to assume that if someone is looking for high income right now, that they're probably not reinvesting all of their dividends for 10 years. So I went ahead and calculated Realty Income again without reinvestment. So it changes quite a bit. You wind up with 2,200 shares today. And that's dividends not reinvested. That is a mistake on my part. So you wind up with $7,106 in dividends, yield on cost of 7.1. And just to be fair, I went back and did ADP without dividends, and you get 1,150 shares, $6,900 in dividends, and a yield on cost of 6.9%. So if we think about our starting yield here, we're 5%. Our yield grows to 7%, right? But with ADP, we started 2.5%, and we wound up almost at 7%. So you can see the difference, that really the growth that we saw in this dividend is that it's the buying new shares, right? 3,500 shares versus 2,200 shares, yield on cost of 11.3 versus 6.9, or for ADP, and 7.1 by not reinvesting our dividends. So that's a massive change there. And if you remember, ADP's yield on cost with the dividends reinvested was like 8. So you're getting, somewhere between 1.5%, 2% probably in the yield on cost from the dividend reinvestment with ADP, where with Realty Income, you're going from 11.3 down to 7. So 4% change there. And if you want to play with these different strategies for yourself, I've built this calculator where you can put 2 different portfolios in. So this one does not include dividend reinvestment, and it's got one portfolio with a 3% starting yield and a 9% growth rate. The other one has a 6% yield and a 4% growth rate. And you can look and see what your income would be every single year. It's also got this graph where you can see when the high growth portfolio crosses over the higher yield portfolio. It's also got a tab that includes reinvestment of the dividends. So you can see the value of the portfolio and the income. And if we look, we can see that effect that you get from reinvesting a higher yield stock or ETF, that it takes longer for that high growth portfolio to catch up. But you can see this curve's really bending up very quickly. It's going to catch up here. And like I said, consider how long can you reinvest. You might, if you're in this high income strategy, you might only be able to reinvest for the first 5 years. And that's going to change how the rest of this looks. But you can change the numbers up here. You can change the starting yields and the growth rates and just see how all that impacts your income and what's going to best meet your needs. If you want to get this for free, the link is in the description of the video.
So your first $100,000 won't replace your salary, and it's not meant to. It's meant to be seed money that can grow and compound into passive income. And the most important thing in choosing a strategy is your time horizon. That's how much time do you have left before you need the income. So if you're young, it makes sense to focus more on growth, but for someone that's middle-aged or an older person, it might make more sense to focus on either the balance strategy or the high yield strategy to maximize your current cash flow and make sure that your income keeps up with inflation. Remember, if your dividend income doesn't grow, then you're losing purchasing power. So put your money to work, let the payments compound as long as possible, and one day you'll be surprised at how quickly that stream of income and those small payments has grown into a river and a flood of passive income.